Police officers undergo rigorous training to remain calm in the face of absolute danger. But occasionally, an officer walks into a situation so deeply disturbing that all of their training is instantly overwritten by pure, primal terror. An experienced officer was patrolling the dark, isolated dirt roads of Floyd County, Georgia, late one night. It was a completely dead shift. The desolate road was flanked on both sides by thick, dense woods. As his cruiser's headlights swept across the tree line, he caught a split-second flash of movement. Someone had just dove violently into the dark brush on the left side of the road to avoid being seen. The officer immediately stopped his cruiser and hit the high-intensity spotlight, aiming it directly into the thick trees. Nothing moved. Reluctantly doing his job, he stepped out of the safety of his vehicle and slowly approached the tree line, resting his hand firmly on his holstered firearm. Suddenly, the distinct crack of a heavy branch snapping echoed from behind a large oak tree just 20 feet away. The officer drew his weapon, commanding whoever was hiding to step out into the open with their hands raised. A figure slowly stepped out from behind the tree. The officer froze. The person was wearing a disturbing, featureless mask over their face. The officer aggressively ordered the suspect to remove the mask. The masked figure slowly raised their hands, but refused to uncover their face. Instead, they slowly turned their head to the left, as if looking at someone else in the dark, and then looked back at the officer. Suddenly, heavy, synchronized footsteps began echoing from the pitch-black woods to the officer's right. The officer aimed his gun toward the sound, screaming at the top of his lungs for everyone to step out. A second masked figure emerged from the shadows. This one was holding a long, heavy wood-splitting axe in his right hand. Panic set in. Before the officer could radio for immediate backup, the woods around him came alive. The crunching of dead leaves erupted from every direction. Within seconds, the officer was completely surrounded. At least 10 strangers, all wearing identical, terrifying masks, stepped out of the trees, forming a tight circle around the lone officer. Half of them were gripping heavy axes, machetes, and large clubs. The officer stood in the center of the dark road, his gun raised but unable to focus on a single target. He was drastically outnumbered, outgunned, and entirely alone in the middle of nowhere. The silence was deafening. He knew that if they rushed him, he would be dead in seconds. Finally, one of the masked figures broke the suffocating silence. In a deep, muffled, emotionless voice, the figure simply commanded, "Go away!" Realizing they were giving him a chance to live, the officer didn't hesitate. He turned, sprinted back to his cruiser, slammed the gas pedal to the floor, and drove a half-mile down the dirt road before violently shaking and calling for SWAT backup. By the time a massive search squad arrived and swept the woods, the masked group had completely vanished without a trace. The officer firmly believes he had accidentally stumbled upon a dangerous, sadistic secret society preparing to ambush and trap an innocent passerby, and the only reason he survived was because of his police uniform. Routine domestic disturbance calls are often the most unpredictable, volatile situations a police officer can face. A retired veteran officer who had served on the force for 30 years still has nightmares about one specific call he and his partner Steve answered late into their shift. A neighbor had reported loud screaming coming from a house in a quiet neighborhood. When the two officers arrived, they noticed the front door was standing wide open, swinging slightly in the wind. The moment they stepped over the threshold, a toxic, overpowering chemical stench hit them like a physical wall. It was the distinct, toxic smell of a heavily active meth lab. They announced their presence, demanding anyone inside to show themselves. A heavy, violent thump echoed from the second floor. Steve unholstered his weapon, signaling for his partner to follow him quietly up the stairs. On the second floor landing, there were 3 doors. 2 were wide open and 1 was closed. The closed door was exactly where the heavy thud had come from. The veteran officer banged on the wooden door before violently kicking it open. The overwhelming smell of decaying flesh flooded the hallway. In the dark, they could see a lump on the bed. Steve clicked on his flashlight. Lying on the mattress was the heavily rotting, decomposing corpse of a woman. Both officers instantly raised their firearms. Adrenaline pumping, the veteran officer moved to clear the adjacent bedroom. His hand shook so violently he could barely turn the doorknob. He kicked the door open and flipped the light switch. The room was tiny, with no windows and only a filthy cot. Suddenly, Steve screamed from the hallway. The veteran rushed back. Inside the rotting bedroom, a shirtless, severely emaciated man had crawled out from a closet and was lying flat on top of a tall dresser. While both officers were screaming at the man to get down at gunpoint, something shot out from underneath the bed. A frail, filthy hand grabbed the veteran officer's ankle, violently attempting to yank him down to the floor. The officer viciously stomped on the attacking arm, reaching down and dragging a heavily drugged, feral-looking woman out from under the bed. They brutally pinned both suspects to the floor, snapping handcuffs onto their wrists. As they dragged the screaming, crazed couple toward the hallway, a massive, horrifying roar erupted from the pitch-black staircase leading up to the attic. A third man, completely deranged and gripping a large butcher knife high above his head, charged furiously down the narrow stairs directly at the two officers. Steve didn't have time to think. He raised his service weapon and fired, dropping the man dead just 2 feet away from his partner. The investigation revealed the entire house was a trap. The rotting woman on the bed had been murdered weeks prior over a drug debt, and the suspects had been living in the house with her corpse ever since. If Steve's reflexes had been even a second slower, the knife-wielding man would have slaughtered them both in the dark hallway. When responding to burglar alarms in massive, empty commercial buildings, officers rely heavily on the key holder, the person designated to let them inside. 2 officers were dispatched to a motion sensor alarm in a large old medical building that housed several doctors' offices and a pharmacy. Upon arrival, a middle-aged man claiming to be the key holder unlocked the heavy glass front doors for them. Since the stairwell was locked from the inside, the 2 officers took the main elevator up to the 2nd floor alone to clear the trigger zone. The elevator doors slid open to a pitch-black hallway. The only illumination came from a single flickering overhead light at the very far end of the corridor. With flashlights drawn, the officers slowly moved down the hall, physically checking every single office door handle. They were all locked and secured. When they reached the final office at the end of the hall, the handle turned. The door was unlocked. They made entry, sweeping a massive dark reception area and 12 individual exam rooms. The entire suite was completely empty. There were no signs of forced entry. Relieved, the officers exited the suite back into the main hallway. Immediately, something felt horribly wrong. The lighting had completely changed. The overhead light at the far end of the hall where they were standing was now entirely off. Instead, a single light directly over the elevator doors they had just come from was now glowing brightly. The lead officer looked at his partner. The younger cop's face was completely drained of color. "Weren't all of those doors closed and locked when we just walked past them?" the younger officer whispered. The lead officer shined his powerful flashlight down the long corridor. Every single heavy wooden office door that they had just physically checked and confirmed locked was now standing wide open. A sickening wave of dread washed over them. They drew their weapons and began frantically clearing every single office again, terrified of who was following them. As they finished the final sweep and turned the corner to head back to the elevator, the heavy main fire door to the hallway violently slammed shut entirely on its own. Simultaneously, both of their police radios erupted with deafening, aggressive static feedback. Terrified, the officers sprinted for the elevator and rode it down to the ground floor, desperate to find the key holder who had let them in. But the lobby was completely empty. The officer radioed dispatch, demanding the key holder's phone number. The dispatcher's response sent a chill down his spine. She stated that the key holder was still driving and was 5 minutes away. Furious, the officer yelled that the key holder was already there and had unlocked the front doors for them. The dispatcher insisted that was impossible. The alarm company had only just woken the man up. 5 minutes later, the real key holder, a woman, arrived. Confused, The officer perfectly described the middle-aged man who had unlocked the front doors for them. The woman's face dropped in horror. She explained that the man he just described was one of the senior doctors who used to lease the large office suite at the end of the second-floor hallway, the exact suite the officers had cleared. The doctor had brutally committed suicide at his summer home just 3 days prior. The officers had been led into the building and subsequently hunted in the dark by a ghost. Abandoned buildings are magnets for trespassers, but occasionally officers encounter something that defies all human logic inside the decaying walls. A village police officer was dispatched to investigate loud noises coming from a massive, abandoned 2-story convenience store. The building was completely gutted, stripped of everything except the heavy, rusted metal shelving units bolted to the floor. There was no electricity, and the interior was suffocatingly dark. The officer swept the entire first floor with his flashlight. It was completely empty. He cautiously climbed the stairs and cleared the second floor. Every aisle was deserted. Finding no one, he walked back outside to his cruiser, assuming it was just teenagers who had run off. Just as he reached for his car door, he looked back up at the abandoned building. Standing perfectly still in the second-story window was a woman. She had incredibly long, stringy gray hair that hung past her shoulders. She was staring directly down at the officer, and her face was stretched into an impossibly wide, terrifying, mocking smile. Angry that someone was playing games, the officer drew his baton, sprinted back into the dark building, and charged up the stairs, reaching the second floor in less than 10 seconds. He shined his light at the window. It was completely empty. He furiously searched all 3 aisles. He checked behind the rotting checkout counter. He kicked the bathroom doors open. The entire floor was completely empty. There was absolutely nowhere for the woman to have hidden. Unnerved, he walked back outside to his cruiser. He looked up at the window one more time. She was there again, standing in the exact same spot, wearing the exact same horrifying, unnatural smile. Furious and terrified, the officer sprinted back upstairs, running frantically down every aisle, sweeping the beam of his flashlight into every corner of the dark room. He was completely alone. He stood in the center of the dark room, breathing heavily, about to give up entirely. Then, he caught a flicker of movement in his peripheral vision. It wasn't coming from the floor, it was coming from above him. The officer slowly aimed his flashlight directly up at the ceiling. Clinging to the ceiling tiles like a massive, deformed insect was the woman. She had driven 2 heavy metal hooks into the ceiling framework and was holding her entire body weight up by her hands, her bare feet pressed flat against the ceiling tiles for leverage. She was looking straight down at the officer, and that terrifying, crazed, mocking smile was still plastered across her face. The officer was so deeply horrified by the unnatural, demonic display that he didn't even draw his weapon. He turned and sprinted blindly out of the building, jumping into his cruiser and speeding back to the station. He never found out if the woman was a severely disturbed squatter with incredible physical strength or something entirely inhuman toying with him in the dark.